Well, fantastic. We are in Exodus chapter 2 this morning, and I always knew that the day would come when I would forget to bring any sort of form of sermon notes to the service, and I would leave them at home. The day has come. Today is the day. So it's great. It'll be fun. I thought I could rush home at 60 miles an hour and pick them up, which I was going to do. And then I realized that my car is blocked in. So it's not an option. So I've scribbled something down here. But, it's probably a good thing. I feel like, it's the providence of God. Sometimes maybe there was something incredibly heretical in there. Maybe there's something fresh that he wants to bring this morning. We'll find out. And either way, we're kind of in this together now. So I don't really know what I'm doing, nor do you. It's fine. We're in it together. So if you could pray for me, I will do my best to kind of crack through Exodus 32. And it's a challenging but an amazing passage, I think, actually. In this particular chapter of the Bible, we see God incredibly clearly in all of his gospel goodness. So I hope you are going to enjoy this morning. So anyway, I was thinking about just about the youth graduating and how brilliant that was this morning. Great, that our young people are part of our church and, we're just one big family together. That's a great thing to celebrate. And they've also been coming to our prayer course, which is on Monday nights. Big shout out for the prayer course. And it was great. Monday night we made a start, and I was thinking afterwards, did we join the youth on the prayer course, or did the youth join us? I decided that we have joined the youth, and that's definitely the way that it is. So great to be doing that together. And so we had a few kind of tables out. We had a youth table, we had a couple of other tables, and Annette was leading one, I was leading another. And on our table, we kind of briefly touched on something Louis was saying last Sunday, if you were here, where he was saying that sometimes following God is a bit like following a sat-nav. I don't know if you remember that last Sunday. He was saying, the sat-nav says turn left, and we turn left, the sat-nav says turn right, and we turn right. And but it's just so difficult to do that, isn't it? And I was thinking afterwards, why is it I find that quite easy with the sat-nav in our car. It's like turn left, turn right, perform an illegal U-turn. I don't care what it says, I'll do it. I'm just like, don't question the sat-nav. And even when it's like turn left and it's like, do not follow sat-nav, road unsuitable for motor vehicles, I'm like, just don't question the sat-nav, we'll keep following it. But when it's God telling me turn left, turn right, perform an illegal U-turn, isn't it so much harder? So much harder, isn't it? I'm like, I feel that maybe it's something in the scriptures and you read and you're like, God, are you serious? Is that actually what you mean for my life? Or maybe it's a nudging from the Holy Spirit and you're like, God, you can't be serious. And I feel like if it's turn left, turn right, turning left is like a steep, cobbled, twisting, horrific road that's the last thing you want to walk down. And then turning right, you're like, Lord, have you seen turn right the other way? It's smooth and wide, and I'm pretty sure I can see an ice cream van over there as well. And isn't it really, really difficult to kind of follow him through the ups and downs of life? And I think one of the reasons why it is so difficult to always be pursuing him, always be going deeper, which, just pause there for a minute, I think actually there's a number of you this morning who have really, and as a church, we've felt that invitation from the Lord in this season. So as we're coming back from church, come back afresh in a deeper and new way. I know many of you have felt like that. And but it's difficult to do that and to have that kind of blinkered effect of, Lord, I'm going to be so obedient to you in everything, partly because of the culture that we swim in and the air that we breathe. So, lots of people would say, wouldn't they, that the Western world, Europe, the United Kingdom, was a Christianized world. And whether you sort of agree that the church and the state mixing was ever a particularly good idea or not, regardless, we did live in a very much Christianized society that has become increasingly post-Christian and secularized over time. And the result of that has been that in our culture and our society, there are many things that we enjoy that have come about because of Christianity and because of the Bible. So a great book to read on this is Dominion by Tom Holland. He's a historian, and he outlines in this book over a long period of time how so many things that we love about Western society have arisen purely because of the Bible. The one that springs to mind particularly is human rights. There's a famous atheist, I'd be able to tell you his name if I had my notes, but there was a famous atheist who said that human rights are essentially a Christian myth. Without Christianity, there is no basis for human rights. Human rights operate on the principle that we are made in the image of God. And if we're not made in the image of God, then we have to find some other way that justifies the fact that we are worthwhile and valuable and important, and each individual counts regardless of their race, religion, belief, whether they're disabled, able-bodied, whatever. It doesn't matter. They're worth something and valuable because they're made in the image of God. But now we live in this society that has almost become like the kingdom without the king, where we're kind of clinging on to all those things that being a Christianized society has given us, but we've excluded God from the picture, and actually said God is dead, or as one prime minister was told by his press secretary, we don't do God. He's removed from the picture, but we kind of still have all of his stuff and all of his blessings and all of the kind of good things that the Christianity gave us. We're still kind of clinging on to those in culture. And I think that kind of creates the kind of atmosphere that we live in and we breathe in, where it's kind of like, do you know what? You can have a lot of the good stuff of being a Christian. You can kind of have, something of a sense of his presence. You can kind of have, this sense of community that we have here this morning. And you can enjoy all of that stuff without really having God much in the picture at all. Like, we can kind of have his blessings without having him. We can have his stuff. We can breathe his air. We can eat his food. But we don't have to have him, which is the lie that basically infiltrates every area of society. Like, we think about, the lies of Satan, and you expect the lies of Satan to be, I don't know what you imagine the lies of Satan to be, but we imagine it to be something quite extreme, don't we? But actually, the greatest lie that he speaks into us is to imagine that somehow we don't need him. We don't need a relationship with him. We don't need to turn left when he tells us to turn left and turn right when he tells us to turn right. It's in the air that we breathe. And so the temptation for each and every one of us as people that live in the Western world is that Jesus becomes a bit of a hobby, becomes something that we do on a Sunday morning, and we kind of sideline him into the background whilst enjoying. Great, got refreshments this morning, back for the second time running. Woo! Brilliant. Isn't it great that we can enjoy that stuff together? But we need him. We need him. And the temptation for each and every one of us, and as a community, is that we minimize him. And that's exactly what happens in Exodus 32, which is the chapter where Israel builds a golden calf. Now, you might kind of imagine that you kind of know what this story is about. Maybe you've read it before. Maybe you've done it in Sunday school. We kind of imagine the story of the golden calf is essentially the story of Israel building a golden calf, obviously, and then worshipping that golden calf instead of God. And it's just straight up idolatry. But actually, as you kind of read the text, you realize that it's not quite as straightforward as that. It's more subtle than that, and it is actually slightly different. So I'll get into it in a minute, but first let me tell you about some of the context before we get there of how Israel are feeling. So basically, if you remember, Moses has been up the mountain for 40 days. He goes up in Exodus chapter 19, and in Exodus chapter 19, you see something I think quite important for this, that Israel are absolutely petrified of God. Right? They've seen what God has done to Egypt. They've followed God through the desert, and how does God manifest in the desert as they follow him? Do you remember? He's a pillar of fire, okay? Pretty scary. So he's a pillar of fire and smoke. He's all-consuming, and then they get to the mountain. God goes up to the top of the mountain, and the top of the mountain is covered in all-consuming fire and smoke. And understandably, Israel are quite scared about, do we really want to be associating with this God? I mean, look at him. He's scary and crazy, and he's made of smoke and fire. And so they're a bit scared of him, obviously. But Moses is the brave one. He goes up the mountain to meet the Lord into the fire and the smoke, and he stays there for 40 days and for 40 nights. And he tells God tells him all that stuff about the tabernacle and the priests, which we've just done in the few chapters previous. But then in chapter 32, it's like the camera pans from the top of the mountain down to what's happening at the bottom, where Aaron and everybody else and the rest of Israel are cracking on building this golden calf. And this is what it says in verses 1 and 2. When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. And for this fellow Moses, he brought us out of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him." So essentially, all the people come to Aaron, and they say, this Moses fella has gone up the mountain. Or maybe this is only a week after he's gone up, okay? they're like, this Moses fellow, he's gone up the mountain. We've got no idea, Aaron. What's happened to him? He's probably died, okay? And just generally, this way of relating to God, it's just not working. I mean, what are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to ever know God when knowing God looks like going up to the top of a mountain and dying? Because that's what they assumed has probably happened to Moses. And so they come to Aaron and they're frustrated and they're like, is there not a way we can kind of, God he needs to work a bit on his public relations, basically. It needs to have a bit of a remarket, a rebrand, maybe just be a little bit less all-consuming fire and smoke and a little bit more normal, okay? A bit more normal. That's basically what happens. And so verses 3 and to 6, this is what it says. This is what happens next. So all the people, verse 2, Aaron answered them when they said that and said, take off your gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing and bring them to me. So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron, and he took what they had handed him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, these are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord. So the next day the people rose early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings, and afterwards they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. So they basically take all their gold earrings, all their gold jewelry, they make it into a big golden calf, and then they worship it. And a bit of an important kind of cultural context to realize to this is that in the kind of surrounding nations, which would all have their own religions, their own understandings of who God was, they would all have similar kinds of idols that they would worship. And they might be calves, they might be other things that are made out of gold or other materials that they would worship. And in these surrounding cultures, they didn't understand that that thing was their God, but that thing represented their God. So and the golden calf in particular, so the calf was actually a symbol used by some other religions around the time, and this may or may not have been the case for Israel, but the understanding with some of these other religions was that their God would actually sit on top of the calf. Wouldn't be the calf, it would sit on top of it. So when Aaron says, Israel, this is your God that's brought you out of Egypt, he's not saying necessarily, this golden calf that we have literally just made, is somehow brought you, this is what has helped you to escape from Egypt, because that would be pretty stupid, right? That's not what he's saying. He's saying somehow that, this God who brought us out of Egypt, who was so scary and we can't approach him, and he's all-consuming, and he's fire and he's smoke and he petrifies you. Well, now we've remarketed him. We've done a PR job on him, and we've made him into something much more approachable. Instead of all-consuming fire and smoke, we've now got lovely golden calf. Isn't that? And it might kind of seem weird to us that that's what God would be, that's for them what it looks like to make God more relatable, because we probably don't particularly relate to the idea of God being a gold, riding on top of a golden calf, a bit weird. But for them, that's what everybody else was doing. That's what the surrounding cultures were doing. It was normal. It was like, hey guys, Aaron's like, I fixed it, right? We can just be like everybody else, and it will be fine. And you even see in the passage some similarities. So Israel was supposed to melt down their earrings to make the Ark of the Covenant the place upon which God's presence would rest. And instead, they take their gold earrings and they make it onto this golden calf, which, if I'm right in that kind of cultural context, is the place where they imagine God's presence rests. They then come before it and they have this feast before the Lord of sacrifices and celebrations. That's exactly what they were supposed to do before Yahweh. So it's not necessarily that they think they've discovered a new God that's going to save them. They've just taken what they knew already that was scary and petrifying and they didn't understand, and they've made it relatable and more human and easier to understand, and they've just kind of toned it down a little bit. Doesn't it sound familiar? Doesn't it sound like exactly what we're tempted to do so much of the time, Just take this idea of God that petrifies us, and I don't know how you imagine him. Maybe it's like a glorified Father Christmas, a great grandfather figure who's just there to dispense gifts. And in some parts of the church, it's, Jeremiah 29:11, I love that verse. God's got a plan for your life, and it's going to be fast cars and hotels and houses, and it's going to be amazing. And Jesus loves you, and he's your friend. And of course, all of that's true, but that's all you ever hear. Just kind of forget about, pretend, don't read church history for a start, about, the apostles being thrown off buildings and having their legs broken and crucified upside down and killed. We'll just forget about that stuff. Just lovely, cuddly Jesus. And maybe, forget about the fact that the fastest growing churches in the world are in the places where it's punishable by death to become a Christian. It's easy, isn't it, for us as we sit here today in these comfy building and these comfy chairs to forget that, that's the reality of following God. It's difficult. Sometimes it feels more like driving at 120 miles an hour with a blindfold on, listening to the sat-nav saying turn left in 300 yards. And it's petrifying. You think, I can't possibly do that. And I don't know about you, but I have these realizations all the time. I'll read in the Bible and it'll be like, love your enemies. Like, are you serious, Lord? Is that what you're calling us to do? Or when Jesus says that you're to, he tells them they're to keep speaking the gospel until their family and friends hate them. They're even to leave their mother, their brother, their sister, desert their family for the cause of following Christ. It's hard. Sometimes, I don't know about you, I have these little moments. Occasionally I get a little prompting from the Spirit to go and speak to somebody random or pray for them. And I'm like, Lord, the thing about that is no. I just don't want to do it. It's really, really difficult, isn't it? I'll level with you. This is, we're in this together. Like, you struggle with this, I struggle with this, we struggle with this as a church. But there's something about obedience that's incredibly important. I think we kind of, in a very abrupt way, see that highlighted in the next section of this. So what happens is that they build this golden calf, and then God turns to Moses, verse 7, and says this: the Lord then said to Moses, go down, because your people whom you brought up out of Egypt have become corrupt. They've been quick to turn away from what I commanded them, and have made themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf. They have bowed down to it, and sacrificed to it, and have said, these are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. I have seen these people, the Lord said to Moses, and they are a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone, so that my anger may burn against them, and that I may destroy them. Then I will make you into a great nation. Right, this is pretty bad, right? God's like, okay, well, if these people are not going to be obedient to me, if they're not going to listen to me, if they're not going to kind of face up to what it is that I'm going to calling them, then I have no choice but to desert them, to turn my back on them. And he says, I'm going to destroy them, Moses, and I'm going to start afresh, and I'm going to start afresh to you. And that just makes you think, doesn't it? This is we're not playing games here, as we come before God. I want to say to you this morning, you know what? You are safe in the blood of Jesus. And there is no danger that you are going to be destroyed in the same way that Israel was in danger of being destroyed, because his blood has covered us. We'll come to that again in a minute. But there is something incredibly serious about obedience and following the Lord. I remember Mike Pedavachi at Soul Survivor years ago saying obedience is the love language of God. It's the love language of God. If we want to see him move in power, if we want to see him have an effect on society, if we want to see him transform our lives and the world around us, obedience, radical obedience is the key. God says of Israel that they are a stiff-necked people. And stiff-necked was like an agricultural term used to describe, animals that would, basically be really difficult to control, like an ox or a donkey that wouldn't turn left and wouldn't turn right because it had a stiff neck. And, if it was written today, God would say, these people are like a car without power steering. Like, I can't parallel park them. I can't drive them around. It's like they've got the steering lock on. We're trying to say go left and they won't go left. We're trying to say go right and they won't go right. And God is, his plan for Israel is to use them to be a blessing to the nations, to the world around them. He wants to use Israel as his chosen people to bring about his blessing, his presence, his rule, his reign, his glorious holiness. He wants to bring it to the world, and he wants to bring it through Israel. But how is he supposed to do that with a bunch of people that are stiff-necked, that will not be obedient, that will not listen, that will not turn left, will not turn right? His only choice is to abandon them. Okay, it's really, this is serious, isn't it? But something then happens that is so significant and so encouraging. God is at this point of giving up. But then Moses, in verse 11, says this. It says, Moses sought the favor of the Lord his God. Lord, he said, why should your anger burn against your people, whom you brought out of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say it was with evil intent that he brought them out, to kill them in the mountains and to wipe them off the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce anger, relent, Do not bring disaster on your people. Remember your servants Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, to whom you swore by your own self. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I will give you your descendants in all this land I promised them, and it will be their inheritance forever. Then the Lord relented, and he did not bring upon his people the disaster he had threatened. So you see something amazing that happens here in this passage, okay? So he's got a bunch of people who don't want to listen to the spiritual sat-nav. They're pretty disobedient. They're a lot like us much of the time. And God is at the point of giving up on them. But then something significant happens. Moses prays. Moses intercedes. To intercede means to stand between two parties, okay? Moses stands in the middle. He identifies with Israel, and he prays on behalf of them that the Lord would relent. And he appeals to God's character. He appeals to God's promises. He appeals to what God has done in the past, and he appeals to God's glory. And he's like, God, will you not, you need to save them. This is who you are. And it's in that moment that then something seems to happen, and it's like it unlocks that purpose of God that was there before and seems to have been, unable to operate because Israel are disobedient. Somehow it unlocks as Moses prays. And it's like, I'm trying to think the best way to describe this, because we could read this and think, oh, well, God, it's like God just basically changes his mind. He's like really angry one minute, Moses calms him down, and then he's fine. And that's, it can be easy, but it's not like that at all. I think a really helpful way to understand it is first to understand what is God's will in general, okay? And, slight bit of understanding on this, okay? So God is kind of like infinite in every attribute, okay? So he's infinite in his love. This is why it's so scary and difficult to come to know, isn't it? He's infinite in his love. He's infinite in his grace. He's infinite in his anger. He's infinite in his wrath. And that's kind of petrifying. But we see throughout the scriptures that he does have, it's difficult to know how to describe it, but it's almost like God has a particular way of leaning that leans more in one direction than another. And the way in which he tends to lean is in the direction of blessing and grace and love and kindness. So Isaiah says, his judgment is like his strange work, okay? Like he does judge, and he's infinite in his judgment, and he's infinite in his anger, but it's strange to him. What's natural and what's normal is for him to bless and for him to love and for him to pour out his grace. In a few chapters' time, in Exodus 34, it's kind of, Moses describes it like, God, he judges to the third and fourth generation, but his blessing extends to the thousands. Because that's the general way in which he works, right? He's there to extend his blessing and his grace and his goodness. That's the general direction of his will. But, so if that's what's happening with these people in Israel, he's trying to bless them. He's trying to love them. He's trying to lead them into this promised land that's going to be glorious and overflowing with milk and honey, and he's going to be there and he's going to be present with his people. But he can't do it. He can't exercise his will for them because they're not obedient to him. And so it's a bit like, you imagine it like this. Israel are like hard ground, right? They're tough. Nothing is penetrating them. And God's love and God's grace and his goodness is raining down on them. But every time it rains down, it just floats off the surface. It can't get through. It can't penetrate that ground because they're so hard of heart. But then something happens that allows God's will for them to break through, and that is intercession. Intercession is what releases the will of God over us and over people's lives. Moses prays. He stands in the gap. Later on, he says, God, take my life if it means that they can go free. He identifies with Israel by the very fact of his own life, and he prays out for them to be saved. And because there is one place in that hard ground where there's almost like a funnel, where, and Moses is like that funnel. He receives God's grace and his love and his blessing. It fills him and it overflows and it flows out into the rest of Israel. So it's not as if God changes his mind. It's like in this moment when Israel are stiff-necked and they're disobedient and they're hard-hearted and they don't want to know him, it's like game over. There's no way forward until Moses prays. Because when Moses prays, he becomes like that funnel that unlocks by intercession the will of God over the lives of the people in Israel. Now, there is good news for us this morning, because for those of us that often feel hard-hearted and struggle to follow the spiritual sat-nav, there is, of course, one who follows in the pattern of Moses as an intercessor, who stands on behalf of all of humanity and intercedes in the gap and cries out and calls out for us to be saved, and his name is Jesus Christ. And through the intercession of Jesus, through the prayer of Jesus, you are released from that hardness of heart, from the difficulty of coming before the Lord, who's scary and all-consuming and fire, to actually come to get to know him. The intercession of Jesus releases the will of God over your life, his blessing, his love, his grace, his kindness, which means that, okay, you struggle, okay, I struggle. There are times in which I ignore that spiritual sat-nav and I go off and do my own thing. But every single time, it is never, ever, ever too late to come back to him, to submit to him, to come to him in obedience and allow you to be that funnel because of what Christ has done in you, to fill you with love so that you extend it to other people. And isn't that exciting? You know, I think that the danger of when we tone down God and we make him, you know, we just kind of do our own thing, Christian becomes a bit of a hobby and, you know, becomes a bit of an ego boost for us, is that we miss out on the fact that this morning we can actually know God, the infinite creator of the universe, the one that flung stars into space, the one who's there from the beginning, the one who's eternal, the one who's infinite in every attribute. And you can actually know him this morning despite your hard heart, despite your sin, despite your disobedience, because of Jesus Christ. And I think that, you know, for me anyway, I never became a Christian because it was a great social club. No offense. I became a Christian because it was a wild adventure. Because I was like, wow, this is amazing. You can actually know God. You can actually know him. And it's that excited me, and I think it's that will excite other people. So we've got to grasp hold of this, the fact, yes, we might be like Israel, we might be disobedient, but Jesus has interceded on our behalf. We can still come back to him again and again and again and again and recapture that first love, that sense of adventure, that sense of wildness, and go after the fire and the smoke, fill ourselves afresh with passion, feel the Spirit poured out on us again. It is never too late to experience that. But the other thing that I think is amazing is that we are called, aren't we, to be Jesus' apprentices, are we not? We're to be his followers. We're to apprentice after Jesus. And so what Jesus does, we are to copy. So as Jesus intercedes on our behalf so that we might be filled with his grace, with his love, with his compassion, so we too are called to go and intercede on behalf of other people and pray for them so that we might become that conduit for God's blessing. Just like Moses was to Israel, just like Jesus was to us, we are to follow in the same pattern and do the same thing. And to go out into the world as intercessors, as prayer warriors, as people who know, you know what, I know him. I know God who's holy, and I'm going to pray to him through my relationship to him on your behalf, and through my prayer, release blessing into your life, release God's goodness into your life, release his grace into your life, because intercession releases the will of the Father. So do you see what the calling, the great calling, I think, of this passage here this morning, in a way, is that we would follow not in the pattern of Israel and tone down God, not at all. Instead, we'd follow in the pattern of Moses and become intercessors who are striving after and struggling after bringing the holy presence, magnificence of God into every area of the world, into every area of society. I love, some of you have been reading Dirty Glory, and one of the quotes that I love in that book, Pete Greig says that the rusty hinge of history is the bended knee. That through the kind of ebb and flow of society and culture, again and again, it has been prayer movements that have changed the whole world, because intercession releases the will of the Father. You know, it was intercession and it was prayer in this chapter here that saved the lives of Israel. It was intercession and prayer that have started every single great revival in history. It was a national day of prayer that preceded the miracle of Dunkirk. It was like 120,000 people gathered to pray the night before the Berlin Wall fell. Maybe it's a coincidence, or maybe intercession releases the will of the Father. And that when we gather as his people and pray, stuff happens. Stuff changes. Stuff shifts as we become a conduit for his blessing to move out over the whole of society. So, you know, I want you to be excited about this. You know, that actually, you know, we've felt as a church in these kind of coming months to move into a season of prayer. We've got a 24/7 prayer event coming up later in the term. And to just think, this is amazing. This is God's call on us to move into this period of intercession for our nation. One verse that I know has been on the mind of a lot of people through lockdown has been 2 Corinthians 7, verse 14. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and I will heal their land. There's something that happens as we pray, he hears us. And as he hears us, it unlocks something within his will that is then able to flourish out in the world. And it isn't like God's really nitpicky. He's like, oh, well, I can't do it until, I won't do this until you say that. It's not like a legalistic kind of thing where we pray and then, somehow that creates enough points in the system and then he unlocks something for us. But it's actually through the process of you praying that something is unlocked in the heavenlies, that somehow then comes about and manifests in physical reality, that changes lives and transforms the world and lives around us. And I think part of it is to do with obedience. Jesus tells us, doesn't he, this is how you are to pray. There's instructions throughout the Bible for us to pray without ceasing, and to actually come to know him and develop that relationship with him where we start to walk in obedience. And I think as we do this, it's not like we earn points with him, but it's in the process of the doing that the blessing comes. It's like you've got a bank account that's got millions of pounds in it, but you've never transferred it. You've never done that process of transferring it into your current account, and so you're always complaining that you're poor all the time. But that blessing is there for you, right? It's in that savings account. It's been given to you. And, the will of the Father, his love, his grace, his compassion for your life, and the way that we unlock it is through obedience and relationship and intercession and prayer. We start to release the will of God over our lives. I want to tell you one story before we finish. And I'll confess I saw this story from Brian Parker. So shout out Brian if you're watching this morning. He sent it to me on WhatsApp. And it's an amazing story. So it's the story of a guy called Dr. Orr. Some of you probably know this. You've heard it before. But it's the story of a guy called Dr. Orr. He was a seminary professor in the States. And he brought a group of seminary students over to the UK to go and visit various places of interest throughout Christian history across London. So they're going around, and I guess they do the British Museum, and there's various kind of Bible artifacts in there. Maybe they go to see the Metropolitan Tabernacle where Spurgeon preached. And they go around and they visit various different things. Anyway, they come to, you guys I know this story. And then they come to the house of John Wesley. And so Dr. Orr takes these students into the house of John Wesley. And if you don't know John Wesley, he was basically the person that started one of the greatest revival movements of all of history. He rode hundreds of thousands of miles around the country on horseback, preaching the gospel to people. And as he did, churches were planted, or small discipleship groups were planted that later grew into churches, the Methodist Church. We would not be sitting here today without the ministry of John Wesley. He started the Free Methodist movement, in effect, that we are a part of this morning. And the result from that was not just transformation as people became Christians, but it was social transformation. It was through the ministry of what John Wesley started that we saw things like the emancipation of slavery, through which we saw things like even the start of the RSPCA. All of these, so many things across society, you trace back where they came from in terms of education removes and education stuff, healthcare, social care, and it all seems to stem back to this one period in history, the Great Awakening, and one man, John Wesley. And so these students, they're so excited as they go into the house of John Wesley, this man who changed history. And they go into his kitchen and they say, oh, John Wesley, he was not that holy, he still ate food. And then they go, they see, this lounge, this is where John Wesley met and prayed with people. And John Wesley's study, and this is where he sat and he prepped sermons and he wrote stuff and he studied, and his books are still there, and these students are amazed by that because they're seminary students, they love that kind of thing. And then they go upstairs and they see John Wesley's bedroom. This is where John Wesley slept. And then one of the students asks, they say, oh, Dr. Orr, what's that little thing on the carpet down there next to John Wesley's bed? And next to the carpet there's these two deep wells, just oval shapes in the carpet by his bed, where the carpet is worn thin. And there's almost an indentation in the ground. And Dr. Orr says, well, that is where John Wesley knelt to pray at 4 a.m. for 4 hours every single day. And isn't that amazing? You just think, wow, intercession unlocks the will of the Father. There's something about the prayers of John Wesley that have meant that even us here this morning we're sat here, in part because lots of people prayed for you, but also because of the heritage of the prayers of John Wesley, who prayed for 4 hours every single morning. Okay, probably they didn't have electricity. Maybe he went to bed at 7:30. But you see what I'm saying? There's something about the power of prayer that unlocks the will of the Father. Anyway, it's time to go. So Dr. Orr rounds up all the students, and they get back onto the bus, and they leave the house, get back onto the bus, and Dr. Orr, he gets the students on the bus, and he counts them, and just to check that everybody's still there. And as he counts them, he notices that there's one student missing. So he goes back into the house, and he looks around, and the student's not in the kitchen, not in the lounge, he's not cheekily stealing one of John Wesley's books. He's not there. So he goes upstairs, and he finds the door ajar to the bedroom. And he goes into the bedroom, and he sees this one student there, and he's knelt down by the bed with his knees in those same wells where John Wesley would kneel to pray. And Dr. Orr just listens at the door for a minute as he listens to this student praying, and he's saying, "Do it again, Lord. Do it again, Lord. Do it again, Lord. Do it again, Lord, and use me." So then Dr. Orr lets him finish, and he goes over, puts his hand on his shoulder, and says, "Son, it's time to leave. Got to get back on the bus now." And then, Billy Graham stood up, got back on the bus, and then God did it again. The power of prayer, the power of intercession is what unlocks God's wills for the Father. It's like every time he's looking, how can I bless? How can I extend my grace? How can I reach out to these people and steer them in the right way so they're going to come to this place of blessing of my presence? But we're like, oh, let's tone him down. Let's reduce him. Let's pretend that he's less. Guys, if we want to see him move and transform, we've got to come back to him in prayer, in confidence, knowing that Jesus has interceded on our behalf so that we can stand before him secure, and believe that actually this power of prayer is what changes history. That it's prayer that is the rusty hinge on which history swings. Do you believe it? Do you believe this morning that God can do it again? I mean, who knows? We're just one church in Lancaster, and here we are. But I know that in every revival and every history, it's come about when God's people have got desperate and when God's people have prayed.